Hi, welcome to Hillcrest Sermons, growing together.
Show us your heart's delight.
Well, good morning, Hillcrest. My name is Stephen Shetterly. I am a resettlement manager with an organization called World Relief. Really happy to be here with you this morning. Thank you for welcoming me to this place, and thank you for that scripture reading. That was beautiful. I love hearing God's word in different languages and just being reminded of the fact that, we didn't write this word. This is a word for all of us that God wants to be known by all people. So that was a beautiful reminder of that. My history with Hillcrest goes back a few years, 20 plus, I think. I was freshman at Western back in the late 90s when I got connected with this strange group on campus called Campus Christian Fellowship. And that really became a transformative thing for my life, came to faith through that, hanging out with people like Brady Bobbink and Dave Niebel. And so thank you for just your many years of faithful witness here in this community. It's so great to just be here and to be able to share with you all this morning. So a number of years ago, my wife and I, we lived and we worked for about 6.5 years in a country in Southeast Asia. And we weren't officially missionaries there because missionaries don't officially exist in the country where we lived. But I taught English at a local university there, and we lived lives trying to reflect the love of Jesus to the people around us. But as a not quite missionary living overseas, I was often conscious of the fact that I thought we had a problem. It wasn't that, we were hounded by angry crowds who wanted to run us out of town because of our faith. It wasn't that we were sick with various wasting tropical diseases. In fact, we were usually more healthy while we were there than when we came back to America with all the processed food and sedentary lifestyle and things like that. It wasn't any of those things that you might associate with a missionary lifestyle that were the problem. Disease, persecution, war, famine, none of that. My problem was that life was just too good. We lived across the street from a gorgeous tropical beach. I think we have a slide here. This wasn't right across the street. This was just a couple miles down the road from us. My students in the classes that I taught, they didn't try to stone me, but they would rise to their feet in respect every day when I entered their class. A short bus ride could take us to a 4-star resort where we could eat brunch, overlooking the turquoise sea and the white sand beach, palm trees rustling in the gentle breeze coming in off of the water. As enjoyable as it was, I had this nagging sense that this was not okay. In order for us to be doing legitimate mission work, there needed to be a lot more suffering going on. I'd read missionary biographies. I knew how these things were supposed to go, and they weren't supposed to involve sipping delicious iced coffee in the shade of your favorite open-air beachside cafe on a regular basis. What self-respecting monthly supporter of ours was going to keep funding our work if they knew how good that we had it? If they knew that the biggest struggle that we faced on a daily basis was that we needed to put on a very high SPF sunscreen or risk getting a painful burn when we went out. Okay, so obviously I speak kind of in jest. We loved our time in Southeast Asia, and I do think that it was legitimate ministry, mission even, and that there was a fair share of suffering involved, even if we endured it in a tropical paradise. But what is it about Christianity and suffering, particularly Christian missions and suffering, that makes us feel sometimes like the two go together, that the one entails or requires the other? I want to explore that today, the idea of suffering as an integral part of the Christian walk. And it's an integral part, I think, that we have largely forgotten in the American church. Yet it's one that I think can be recovered in some pretty surprising ways. So you might be asking, where does mission fit into all of this? I thought this was supposed to be a talk about missions. Fair enough, we will get to that part. We'll talk about missions too, but maybe from a different angle than what we're used to. So, suffering. Let me say, first of all, that I am terrified of suffering. When I see others who are suffering, I'm prone to run in the opposite direction. When I feel it coming for me, I do my best to numb it, to ignore it, to distract myself from it. And when I can't avoid it or ignore it, I at least want a quick fix, an easy answer, a tidy, satisfying explanation as to why this is happening to me. And in this, I don't think I'm too different from most of humanity. All the major world religions have their different approaches to suffering. Buddhism, for example, recognizes that suffering is the primary human condition and that the solution is to rise above it, to stop desiring something better and to discover that suffering has no hold on you because, like everything else, it is impermanent. It is a passing and temporary thing. In Islam, you endure suffering as an act of submission to God. He is sovereign. And it's not our place to question or to second guess the good or the ill that comes from his hand. And in modern Western consumer culture, which is kind of its own religion, suffering can be avoided if we just buy the right products, take the right vacations, prescribe the right medications, elect the right politician, find the right career. The solution always seems to be just a few dollars beyond us. If only we could make a little more, spend a little more. And then Jesus enters the picture. What an altogether unusual character he is, this man who is God. So in Jesus we find a sovereign king, the one through whom all things were created, in whom all things hold together. And instead of ignoring suffering or telling his followers to just grit their teeth and power through it because it's God's will that they suffer, Jesus does this remarkable thing. He takes suffering, our suffering, upon himself. The early Christians, they were convinced that just as surely as he was Lord of the universe, he was also somehow despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Surely he took up our pain, he bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. Those were the words of the prophet Isaiah, writing centuries before Christ. But in those words, the first followers of Christ saw very, very clearly the image of their Savior, a suffering servant. And make no mistake, this was a scandal for anyone in the ancient world who came across this weird messianic branch of Judaism that we now call Christianity. It was a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. If God is all-powerful, as he must be, then why wouldn't he just snap his fingers and make all this suffering and bad stuff disappear? Isn't that what you would do if you were omnipotent? That seems to be the straightest path to where we all want to go, right? And yet the path that Jesus takes is anything but straight. Philippians 2, which we read earlier, which I think we have a slide for, says, he was in very nature God, but he did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Jesus, as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, he could have chosen to do anything when faced with the problem of human suffering. And what he chose to do was to humble himself and to die on the cross. He chose to suffer with us and for us. It is absurd, and it is our salvation. By his wounds, we are healed. I would say that most Christians today, in the North American context, if they do think about suffering at all, think of it in these basic terms. Jesus suffered, so I don't have to. Jesus suffered, so I don't have to. Thank you very much, Jesus, for handling all of that difficult stuff. Let's move on now to the happy stuff, to eternal life and boundless joy and all of that. And while there is much truth to the idea that Jesus suffered in order to save us from the eternal consequences of our sin, Christians still live and move and have our being in a broken world marked by deep suffering. There is a vast chasm between the way things are and the way that we feel that they should be. The Apostle Paul saw this disconnect. He felt and he lived this disconnect in his own life. And he knew that Jesus was the only way to make sense of it all. Claiming, like so many of us do, that Christ suffered so I don't have to, simply doesn't line up with reality. Suffering and adversity comes for us all, eventually. Christians suffer, sometimes more than others. That's a fact. If you'll recall from the book of Acts, one of the very first things that the Lord says about Paul, even before his conversion, while his name is still Saul, is this. This man Saul, he's my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles, to their kings, to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. Paul, in his own way, was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. So instead of denying reality and saying Christ suffered so I don't have to, Paul flips it all on his head and he says, Christ suffered, therefore so will I. For example, in Philippians 3, Paul writes, I want to know Christ, yes, to know him and the power of his resurrection and participation in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow attaining to the resurrection from the dead. In Colossians 1, he even says, now I rejoice in what I am suffering for you, and I fill up in my flesh what's still lacking in regard to Christ's afflictions for the sake of his body, which is the church. Instead of being the greatest argument against the existence or the goodness of God, then suffering becomes a way of participating in the life of Christ. Let me say that again. The existence of suffering is not some way of disproving the existence of God or of arguing that he isn't as good as we make him out to be. Instead, suffering is a way of participating in the life of Christ. Going back to that passage from Philippians 2 that we talked about just earlier, about how Jesus was in very nature God, but he took the form of a servant, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. It's not just a description of what Jesus did back then, but it is a roadmap for those of us who would follow Jesus today. This is the path that Jesus walked. This is the path that we, his people, also walk. I think the great 18th century hymn writer Charles Wesley nailed it, as he often did. Soar we now where Christ has led, following our exalted head. Made like him we rise, ours the cross, the grave, the skies. Alleluia. Did you catch the order there? Ours the cross, the grave, the skies. Many of us want to take a shortcut to the skies. But not only is that theologically bankrupt, it also totally messes up a really good hymn. Ours the skies, alleluia. No, that's not the way. There's a cross, then there's a grave, then there's the skies. And all of those are ours in Christ. If I'm reading my Bible correctly, being united with Christ means unity with him, not just in his resurrection, but in his suffering too. Not pointless suffering, not endless suffering, not hopeless suffering, but suffering with Jesus for the sake of others. Here is the problem, though, for those of us living in 21st century America. We don't know how to suffer well. The word in the New Testament that's probably most associated with this idea of suffering is thlipsis. It's a fun word. Go ahead, say it with me. Thlipsis. Yes. And like most weighty theological terms, it's basically untranslatable. Sometimes it's rendered as persecution or oppression or suffering or affliction or trouble. It has an almost physical property to it of being crushed, ground down, pressured, constrained, like someone placed in a vice that's being slowly tightened. You can imagine for the earliest followers of Jesus that this was a daily reality. Because of their faith, because of their lifestyle, because of who they chose to identify as Lord and God, they underwent a great deal of thlipsis, pressure, persecution, affliction. It came with the territory. Martyrdom was not difficult to come by in those days. But as time went by, Christianity became more broadly accepted. Persecution by the outside world faded away, so some people sought to create their own version of thlipsis by heading into the desert and fasting, living in caves, giving up all worldly possessions. Those are the desert fathers and mothers, the forerunners of the monks and nuns of later years. And so they embraced a high degree of discomfort and adversity in thlipsis because they felt that it brought them closer in union with Christ. How drastically things have changed in the church since those days. Or I should say how drastically things have changed in the Western church since those days, since there are still plenty of places in the world where being a Christian leads to very real, literal thlipsis. There are plenty of countries where suffering and oppression is an expected part of the whole package of following Jesus. But not here. I mean, some of us are very good at identifying oppression where it probably doesn't exist. You know, the checker at Target said Happy Holidays to me instead of Merry Christmas. Clearly, the Great Tribulation has begun. And while I am very aware that there are many people within the American church who are familiar with suffering, as a group, I don't think we're very good at it. And I fully include myself in that count, by the way. I'm terrible at dealing with my own adversity. I'm even worse at seeing and caring for others who suffer. I don't know how to suffer, but I know some people who do. I know people for whom a passage like Psalm 55 is not some ancient text, but their own lived experience. We can bring that passage up as well. Listen to my prayer, O God. Do not ignore my plea. Hear me and answer me. My thoughts trouble me. I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked, for they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death have fallen on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. I said, oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away and be at rest. I would flee far away and stay in the desert. I would hurry to my place of shelter, far from the tempest and storm. I imagine those words in the mouths of some of the refugees I've come to know these past few months, and it utterly rocks the way that I see Scripture and God and Jesus in his suffering. Starting about a year and a half ago, through a series of events I can only describe as miraculous, I was able to start partnering with this Christian organization called World Relief, specifically to see if Whatcom County might become a place that could sustain a refugee resettlement program. I'm not going to go into all the details of that. I'd be happy to give you the backstory at another time. But the long and the short of it is that this past December, myself and a small team of volunteers found ourselves welcoming the first in a series of Afghan families and individuals who had been evacuated during the fall of Kabul. They had fled their home country on a moment's notice, sometimes with just the clothes on their backs, spent months living on military bases overseas and in the U.S., and then, right at the holidays, here they were being resettled along with tens of thousands of their countrymen all around the U.S. in the biggest refugee crisis since the end of the Vietnam War. With World Relief, we've had the great privilege of welcoming 31 Afghans so far, men, women, and children, into Whatcom County. Greeting them at the Bellingham Airport, usually in the middle of the night, finding them temporary accommodations in host homes, helping them navigate the labyrinth of signing up for government services, getting all their documents in order, getting them into English classes, enrolling their kids in school, trying to find clothes that fit them at Walmart, easier said than done, locating affordable long-term accommodations, getting them started in jobs, working with neighbors and community groups and volunteers to make this as welcoming a place as we could. It has been exhausting since we leaped from ground zero straight into crisis mode with all of this. Some of it has been physical exhaustion. There are only so many hours in the day to get done all the things that need doing. Some of it has been an emotional, spiritual exhaustion as we have felt the weight of these families who literally rely on us for the food on their table and the roof over their heads. A paperwork delay on our part could lead to a family's food stamps being canceled, for instance. But whatever discomfort or adversity my team and I have suffered these past few months is nothing compared to what these new neighbors of ours have been through. Uprooted from their homes, torn away from family, losing careers and houses, status and culture, familiar foods and sounds and smells. Some of them witnessed unspeakable horrors during their escape. Others don't know whether their loved ones are imprisoned or facing starvation or even alive anymore. And while it would be natural and proper for us to feel pity and empathy for people who have suffered so much, I want to suggest something more. I want to suggest that we need these new neighbors of ours. We need them maybe more than they need us. We need them because suffering with and for others is a central calling of the Christian life that we have forgotten how to do on a societal scale in America. I don't know how to suffer, but I know people who do. I know people who have been despised and rejected by mankind, who are people of suffering and familiar with pain. And certainly I want to help alleviate some of that pain to let them know that they no longer need to be despised and rejected, but I also want to learn from them. I want these new neighbors of ours to show me that a life marked by suffering need not be the end of all things, that it need not lead to bitterness and defeat, but that it can in fact be a pathway to new life. I want to see in the faces of these new neighbors of ours some glimpse of Jesus. It was around midnight one evening this past December. I was sitting at the Bellingham airport with one of our Afghan interpreters, trying to stay awake while we waited for one of our first arrivals, a young family of 3 who had evacuated from Kabul. While we were waiting for the plane to land, I passed the family's case file over to our interpreter so he could familiarize himself with the names of these refugees who would be joining our community. And the interpreter glanced at it and he kind of laughed. He said, "This name," he said, pointing where the young dad was listed in the file, "this is Jesus." Sure enough, the dad of this family had the Muslim name for Jesus, and his last name was the Muslim word for Christ. I kid you not, we were waiting for Jesus Christ. So there I was a few weeks before Christmas on a cold, silent night, waiting in an airport for a young family in need of refuge. I was waiting for Jesus Christ to make his way out to baggage claim so that we could pick up the 6 United Nations issue blue plastic duffel bags that they had brought, literally all of their worldly possessions, and to take them to the basement of a mother-in-law suite of a kind Catholic lady and her husband who had opened their home on very short notice. They were the innkeepers who had found room for Jesus and his family that night. I was just the Uber driver to get him there. So Hillcrest Church, I'm convinced that in welcoming these new neighbors, we not only welcome fellow humans made in the image of God, but that we welcome Jesus himself. In case it needed restating, Jesus identifies himself with the poor, the powerless, the oppressed. He identifies himself so closely, in fact, that he becomes one of them. Don't miss the fact that when God chose to become incarnate, to be born as a helpless baby, he didn't choose a royal mansion in Rome or a temple in Athens or a general's headquarters in Babylon. He chose a stable in occupied Palestine, among the oppressed, the colonized, the downtrodden, the forgotten. And he invites his followers to see his face in the faces of the hungry, the thirsty, the foreigner, the incarcerated. Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, truly, I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. I didn't make that up, by the way. That's Matthew 25. I'm also convinced that as we get to know these neighbors of ours who are seemingly so different from us, that we can begin to glimpse not only the face of Jesus, but that we can see ourselves reflected in their faces as well. Because not only are we united with Christ in his suffering, death, and resurrection, we're also united to these sons of Adam and daughters of Eve in our shared humanity with them. In our neighbors from Afghanistan or Ukraine or Sudan or wherever, we can see our common brokenness and sin and frailty and need for grace. And we can hopefully also see our common belovedness. All of us divine image bearers, all of us people for whom Christ became nothing took on the nature of a servant, and died on the cross. So what a gift then. What an absolute gift to live in a community where we can be graced with neighbors who have walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged on the other side. Let me tell you, in case you didn't know, that Hillcrest Church has already jumped in to this work in some significant ways. You have furnished a house and provided clothing and furniture for an Afghan family, a house that was actually made available and accessible to this refugee family by a landlord who goes to this church. You have a team of trained volunteers who are now getting to know that family, helping them navigate the complexities of existing in America, playing with their kids, sharing life in ways that go beyond language and cultural barriers. Thanks to Alex Aline and Talia Knuckles for the different teams that they have assembled to do things like this Curry lunch fundraiser happening right after the service. Thanks to Cameron and Kristen Harris, Stevie Cairns, Joanna Martinez, the whole crew of CCF volunteers who provided tremendous amount of help pulling off an Eid celebration a couple of weeks ago with these new arrivals and with the local Afghan community. What a blessing that was to so many people. There are many and various ways of entering into this work, and those ways will multiply as we are able to welcome more and more families into this community. God willing, these 31 Afghans that we've been able to welcome these past few months are just the beginning of many more new neighbors from many other parts of the world who are going to arrive to enrich our community, to receive help, yes, but also to contribute, to grace us with their presence and their culture, to show us a glimpse of ourselves and Jesus reflected in their faces. So may we have the hearts to receive this as those who walk in the path of the suffering servant. We're going to have a chance, hopefully after the service today, to connect with some of you. My colleague Charity Garza is here. She's waving at you from over there. She's going to be at a table out in the foyer. I will be wandering around in different spots. Would encourage you to connect with us if you'd like to learn more about World Relief and ways of maybe getting plugged in with that work. But right now, let's pray to close. Lord Jesus, you came to us not in power, but in weakness. You came to us as one familiar with suffering. You took our suffering upon yourself. You chose to inconvenience yourself, to humble yourself, to die on a cross for our sake. Lord, and you have laid these things out, not just as something you do, but as a pathway for those of us who would follow you to walk on as well. Would you show us how to do that? Would you show us how, in welcoming these new neighbors to our community, that we can catch a glimpse of you and that we can walk that path that you have laid before us? We ask all of this in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thanks for listening. For more info, visit hcbellingham.com and join us any Sunday, 9 and 11 a.m.